Anybody exhausted after watching that video? Rachel is our kids pastor, and I love that. It's just so raw. Like, I remember those days. I just love to encourage you. I will rarely ask or prompt anything in terms of giving, but if you don't have one of these increased Christmas catalogs, I'd love for you to pick one up. We mailed them out. If somehow you were missed or that was misplaced, you can get them at the Welcome Center, and all of this is online as well. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll really focus on this opportunity that we have to increase Christmas for people around the world. And we're accumulating hundreds of stories of ways that we can tangibly be the hands and feet and mouthpiece of Jesus. I know there's so many wonderful places for our giving to go. I always say this, though. I want Faith Chapel to be the best and most efficient place that you can give to. Everything is giving goes right out the door. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Nate, and I'm just thrilled to be together. Everybody online, welcome as well. We are in part 2 of our thread. It's our final thread of a 12-month series where we're looking at this concept that weaves its way through the entire Bible, and it's the concept of the Messiah. The Messiah. So in Hebrew, Messiah means promised one. And last week, we looked at our first introduction or glimpse of the Messiah. It's way back at the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis 3:15. After everything has changed, the world's come apart because of human rebellion and sin, God says to Eve that one day through you, I'm going to send somebody who will crush the head of the serpent, meaning crush the power of sin and death and the power of the adversary of God. And so from that point on, Genesis 3:15, this concept of Messiah is repeated. And over 400 times in the Hebrew language, in the Old Testament, Messiah is mentioned. 400 times. It is just constant. And then we come to the New Testament age, and the Greeks took the word Messiah, which was Hebrew, and they used the word Christ, which is Greek, and it means anointed one. So the very same concept. And then the New Testament talks about Jesus being the Messiah. So the Old Testament points towards a Messiah to an oppressed people group. Over 400 times, God says, hold on, hang in there. One day I will send a solution. Then the New Testament, 500 times, declares that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. So here's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to look at a couple of questions because there's lots of questions that we have about the Messiah. It's a bit of a foreign concept, probably to many of us. I want to address this. I want to address false messiahs, talk a little bit about that. And I also want to address this question, which I've had several people ask. Why did so many people in the first century who were around Jesus and heard his message and observed him, why were there so few of them who saw him as the Messiah? From his ascension, there seemed to be somewhere around 500 people. Why weren't there more? Why didn't the whole Jewish community declare he's the Messiah? And then I want to talk a little bit about what Messiah came to do, all right? So let's look at this first idea of false messiahs. So throughout human history, there have been thousands of people who have claimed to be a Messiah, specifically in Jewish culture. They were the one who would come and lead people towards freedom and restore everything that has been lost. And all of these messiahs deceived either a small amount of people or a large amount of people. Some of them were deeply deluded. Some of them, we don't know what their motivation was. But Jesus addresses this. Towards the end of his earthly life, he's speaking to his disciples, and he says this in the book of Matthew chapter 25 or 24. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the promised one, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear, and notice this next phrase, it's very interesting, will perform great signs and wonders to deceive. So at times, there would actually be supernatural powers, not of God, behind these false messiahs that would perform things that are inexplicable. People go like, I don't know how to describe that. Therefore, maybe you really are the Messiah. If possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So Jesus leaves a warning with his disciples that there would be these false messiahs. Now, rather than go through hundreds of people who have claimed to be the Messiah since Jesus, I just want to mention three because they're probably the three that gained the most traction in our world in the ancient times. The first is a man named Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba, about 130 AD. So you have to understand that in 70 AD, Rome came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, which just devastated their culture. So this place where they went to meet God, to hear God, it was just this unthinkable thing that their temple was destroyed. And so for 50 years, the people just simmer because their cultural identity is gone, their religious identity is gone. And Bar Kokhba was a brilliant military tactician, and he began to lead small guerrilla bands of Jewish soldiers, and they would attack Roman soldiers, Roman legions, as they traveled throughout Palestine. And as he gained more and more momentum, some of the modern rabbis of the day, the teachers of the day, started to declare Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. It all comes to a surface in 135 AD. Bar Kokhba says, this is the moment, we're going to overthrow Rome. I mean, it's a tiny little group of people in a massive Roman Empire. And as he moves forward in this insurgency, Rome marches in up to 250,000 additional troops. The entire movement is destroyed. Bar Kokhba is killed, and a minimum of 500,000 of his followers die in battle. An additional several hundred thousand, unknown, are taken as slaves. So up to 1 million people are impacted in 135 AD by a man who declared that he was the Messiah. Next one, who is probably most famous, was a man named Moses of Crete. He was from a Jewish community in Crete, and his namesake Moses, the Old Testament Moses, he begins to teach, and he begins to gather people around the empire, declaring that he's indeed the Messiah. And this is how his life ends up. He believes that if he marches into the sea, that like the original Moses, God will part the sea and his people will enter into a new promised land. He and up to 19,000 of his followers march into the sea and all drown. It's tragic. 19,000 people drowning in one instance, following in faith, a name named Moses of Crete. And then lastly, and this is probably the most influential in terms of numbers, Shabbatai Zevi in time of the Ottoman Empire, where Islam has conquered areas where Judaism used to exist. He begins to perform, well, there's no way to verify, but historians say unexplainable acts of power. Miracles happen. He begins to move throughout the country, speaking, claiming, declaring that he's the Messiah. He has this groundswell of people who are hoping for freedom. There's still no temple centuries later. And they gather together, and it looks like perhaps there's going to be some movement, but he is beaten down, taken captive by the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire at the time. He's imprisoned, and he's given a choice to either convert to Islam and tell all of his converts, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, to convert to Islam or to be executed. He chooses to convert to Islam, and tens of thousands of his followers convert to Islam, and that's the end of his claim to be the Messiah. Now, what do all of these individuals have in common? Well, they share some traits, which I'll talk about. But this hope, you can sense if you're an oppressed, we live in this free nation. I know it's imperfect, I understand, but there's not a foreign power that forces us to pay additional taxes and tells us what we can and cannot do. But when you lived in this culture, the hope of freedom, in fact, there's a prayer, it was mentioned, prayed by millions. World War II in the death camps. This prayer would be spoken frequently by people who were moving towards gas chambers or towards some form of torture or death. This is a messianic prayer that Jews prayed. I believe with perfect faith in the coming Messiah, and though he may tarry, yet I still believe. So even in just this last century, there's this hope. He didn't come for me. He didn't come in time to alleviate my suffering, but yet still I believe. So what are some of the common traits of these false messiahs? Number one, they were ambitious individuals with no accountability. They functioned outside of the normal networks. They declared themselves as some sort of deity anointed in a specific way. Number two, these false messiahs, they're teachers of esoteric. So that means vague, unknowable knowledge and available only to an elite group. So they were formed on this idea of secrecy, which is of course so different than Jesus. Jesus, he lives under the submission of his Father. He even lives under the parameters of the Roman Empire. But when it comes to Jesus' teaching, he invites all. It's not just for a select few. Jesus, he actually teaches in parables. He uses the most common everyday occurrences to help people understand who God is and what he's doing. The false messiahs, number three, focus on political and military ambitions. Every one of them, if you look at it. We want power, we want seats of power, we want to win wars. And Jesus is completely the opposite of this. One instance would be when he's being arrested. He looks at Peter, who's just drawn a sword, and he says, Peter, that's not how we do this. Don't you know that those who live by the sword will also die by the sword? He says, I want you to sheath your sword because the battle that needs to be won has nothing to do with military or political ambitions. And then lastly, these false messiahs, there's always a reliance on violence. If you follow them through from even modern day people like the David Koreshes of the world who claim to be messianic, there's always violence wherever they trod. It's continual. And in the case of Jesus, it's the exact opposite. There's calls for peace and calls for forgiveness. There's just no violence. The only violence in Jesus' life was the violence that was perpetrated onto himself. So here's question number two. Why did so many modern day Jews, when Jesus walked the earth, not recognize him as the Messiah? Why was it just so challenging and so difficult? Well, I want you just to imagine for a moment that you are a part of Jewish culture and you are occupied. If it wasn't Rome, then before that it was Greece and Persia and Assyria, and the list goes on and on. And you're always feeling as if you're at the bottom of the ladder. Everybody's always stepping and climbing over you. Well, when you're in that position, you're hoping for someone incredibly powerful to come and change things. So we could go through, hundreds, maybe up to 800 passages in the Bible that would be a messianic type prophecy pointing towards the Messiah. And many of them read something like this. They read like the book of Daniel, where it talks about his power and his capacity. So when you're a Jew and you read something like this from the book of Daniel, at the time of this, Israel's occupied, people have been displaced, the Babylonians and the Persians are in charge, and Daniel has this glimmer of hope that he speaks to the people. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, it's a phrase for God himself, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, power, glory, and sovereign power, meaning divine power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So when you are oppressed and you're praying for a Messiah, that sounds really good, doesn't it? Somebody who's more powerful than Persia or Syria or Rome or Greece or whoever it might be. That he rules the nations of the world. That his dominion is vast and overriding over every power on planet Earth. And so most Jews, when they were looking for the Messiah, they were looking for somebody to fulfill that. To come and chase away the oppressors. To come and fix all the injustice in the world. Now, there's another type of messianic prophecy that is sprinkled throughout the Old Testament, and it's a little bit different than that. It's about someone who suffers. And those weren't nearly as attractive as the prophecies about someone who's all powerful. Let me give you a couple examples of this. Isaiah, we'll read a couple of passages from Isaiah. Isaiah 53, verse 7. Speaking of the Messiah, he was oppressed. Oh, no. Like, we don't want a Messiah who's oppressed. We want a Messiah who defeats oppressors. He says, no, the Messiah was oppressed and afflicted. Does anybody want an afflicted Messiah? I want a Messiah who's going to afflict pain on our enemies. Yet he did not open his mouth. No protest. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a former 4-H member, anytime you link the Messiah with a lamb, that's bad news, because lambs, here's what I know, they're super vulnerable and they're pretty dumb. He says, this is what your Messiah is going to be like. And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Messianic prophecy. Now, this would be the fulfillment of that. Fulfillment from a New Testament passage, Matthew chapter 27. This is Jesus during his arrest. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. As Jesus said, I'll take that on. I will be the defenseless one. Another messianic prophecy from the book of Isaiah, just a few verses earlier. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed. So this thought that the Messiah is going to suffer something horrible, but who's the beneficiary? Humanity. We would be the beneficiaries of that. It's fulfillment in the book of Matthew again, chapter 27. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail to the King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So, if you were looking for a conqueror, it's really easy to read those passages. There's a whole conglomeration of passages in the book of Isaiah talking about a Messiah who would suffer. And it would be easy to gloss over them and say, that's not what we need. We don't need an afflicted Messiah. We need an afflictor. We need someone who can come and right everything that is wrong. And it was so confusing that Jesus, even after his resurrection, he appears in the book of Luke to a group of his disciples who have seen everything, they've heard everything, but they're still confused. Jesus is resurrected, but he's not meeting their expectations of what a Messiah does. And in Luke chapter 24, Jesus, he says this, he walks along with them and he goes, listen, I'm gonna have to help you understand. Let me begin with Moses, the ancient scriptures, and all the prophets, and help you to understand that the Messiah is not what you thought he was going to be, at least not at this moment. The Messiah, there's much more to it. It's more thickly layered than just someone who comes to defeat the Roman Empire. That the Messiah is going to deal with something different. So with that in mind, understanding that there's these two aspects of Messiah, I want to say just a couple of things that maybe help us understand Jesus, the Messiah. Number one, the New Testament writers divide the timeline of history into three parts, okay? Timeline of history into three parts. So we typically think this. We think, even calendar-wise, we do AD and BC and AD, right? Or it's changed now to CE, right? So there's this division, and Jesus literally divides the timeline of history. Well, let me show you this timeline. So biblically, this is how the writers lay out the timeline of history. This is this era before Jesus. So this would be referred to as a time under the law, where the one way that you could relate to God and deal with all the distress in the world would be to follow the Old Testament teachings and to the best of your ability, through sacrifice, through surrender, through acts of obedience, try to find yourself in harmony with God. So it's an age under the law. Then Jesus comes, and it's a brand new day. Okay, so this is often called the former days. Former days. Jesus comes as the Messiah, but not the Messiah that everyone expected. And this is now the age of the church, where there is the possibility for spiritual life and vitality to walk with God, not based upon my obedience to the law, but based upon the person, the work, the resurrection, the death of Jesus Christ. And we live in this age. Now, everybody's saying, well, how, like, where at? Do we live here or here? Well, since Jesus left, everybody thought we were living here, right, for 2,000 years. I don't know, but we're somewhere in this realm where Jesus the Messiah came and he addressed all the prophecies, fulfilled all the prophecies about someone who would come and would be wounded so that we could be healed, who would be afflicted so that we could be forgiven. However, there's a day coming where the Messiah comes back the second time. And the second time, so we read prophecies written during this time. Some of them point here, but some of them point here. The Bible calls this the age to come, where there's a moment of delineation, where when Jesus the Messiah comes back the second time, he comes back in his undiminished glory, is how ancient theologians described it. The first time, his glory is diminished because he's a man. The next time it comes back, you have pictures like this in the book of Revelation. He's riding on a white horse and he's carrying a sword and fire's coming out of his eyes. And he's coming back to address injustice and death. So this is why it was sometimes very confusing, why many people missed that Jesus is the Messiah, because they're drawn to these moments. Let me give you just a poignant example. I'm going to try to do this without crying. Last night, Jen and I get a call from a dear friend, young, 2 teenage sons, who has been fighting a couple-year battle with cancer. I walked into the room at her home, and it's peace and calm. There's grief everywhere, but there's no worry. As she's taking her last breath, Jesus the Messiah won an initial victory. She is walking with her Creator. That the work of Jesus had established a new Eden where she could walk and talk with God, where no one was afraid where she was. They just knew she was with the Lord. But the day when Jesus comes back to deal with cancer once and for all hasn't yet happened. So there was a sense of already, he had already restored her and healed her, but he hasn't removed the blight of cancer from the human condition. So this is the tension that we live in. We live in this era, this age, where we're so grateful for this, and we're waiting for this. We're waiting for Jesus to come back and make all things new. The Bible defines this age, book of Revelation, where He'll wipe every tear from everyone's eyes, where there will be no more death or crying or pain, where lions lay down with lambs and children play next to serpents. There's just an era of everything being made new and restored. Right now we live in an era where the human spirit can be restored, but this body, this biology, oppressive people, regimes, natural disasters, they have yet to be addressed. They'll be addressed here. They'll be addressed here. So this is the timeline of a New Testament concept of what has happened and one day what will happen. Point number 2, if we want to understand Jesus the Messiah, we just need to understand this sequence of events. Jesus came to be the suffering servant first, and he will be the conquering king in the future. Now, he's the conquering king over sin and death, but he has yet to conquer everything else that's wrong in the world. He came first to suffer, to restore, to make new internally what had been so broken. So there's this sense of he's already come, but it's not yet fulfilled. It's partial fulfillment. Number 3, think of it this way. If there was just one simple way to think about it, that when we celebrate Christmas, when we talk about the Messiah, he came and he is coming, okay? So he came. That's why you're here. That's why you're watching. That's why I can wake up in the morning and go, God, you've forgiven me. You love me. You're working in my life. All things are made new internally, but I can look out my window and say, but the world's still broken and you are coming, and I'm anticipating that and I'm hoping. So the Messiah came and he is coming. Now let me give you just a couple of attributes of Jesus the Messiah, just so that we can understand what was accomplished the first time he came to earth, which we're about to celebrate in a couple weeks, right? Christmas, the advent, the arrival of Jesus. Jesus the Messiah, I'm going to use these words. Number 1, he fought. He fought his battle through love and sacrifice, not violence and power. So when Jesus looked out over the Jewish people, when he looked out over the world in the first century, he saw there's an oppressive power that rules people, Rome, yes. He saw, yes, there's all kinds of brokenness, there's disease. He saw, yes, there's people that mistreat one another. Human relationships are fractured and broken, yes, but he said, that's not the battle I came to fight this time. I came to fight a different battle. I came to fight the battle within the human heart where human beings have been isolated with God, and their only hope to be in relationship with their Creator is obedience and sacrifice and following the law, which no one was able to do. So Jesus says, here's the battle I'm going to fight. I'm going to live the life that they could not live. As the Messiah, the man, the God, I will live this life and I will conquer separation from God. And I will not do it through raising armies. I will do it through laying down my life. Sacrifice and love. Number 2, Jesus the Messiah conquered death and sin rather than kings and armies. When Jesus is on the cross, the Messiah calls out, "It is finished." And most of us would go, well, not quite, right? There's still some more things I'd like you to do, Jesus. But Jesus says, my first time on planet Earth as Messiah, I finished what I came to do. I established a new community of people who would represent me and be my hands and my feet and my mouthpiece. I conquered sin and death, that no longer does sin have to rule and reign me. That God has established a new throne. It wasn't a throne in Rome. It was a throne within the human heart where he could be seated as king and I can be his servant. He came and he conquered, but he didn't conquer military forces. He conquered sin and death. Third thing about Jesus the Messiah, his first visit focused on the interior realm, not the exterior realm. Now everybody wanted him to focus on the exterior realm. And by the way, if you're not careful, I think in today's world, we still want Jesus to focus more on the exterior realm than he does. He'll do that one day. He'll do that one day. But Jesus never ran for office, never raised a sword, never tried to unseat any of the people in power. He came to conquer a throne within the human heart. He came to establish something within people. And then here's the fourth trait of the first Messiah. He established an unseen kingdom, not a visible kingdom. So when Jesus is being interviewed by Pilate, a Roman government official, he says, Pilate, here's why this is really hard for you to understand. You say I'm a king, and I say, if you say so, but my kingdom is not of this world. See, everybody wants Jesus to have a kingdom here on planet Earth. Jesus says, I came to establish a kingdom where human beings can be at peace with their Creator, where human beings can take on a new ethic. And it's not one of me first. It's an ethic of love and surrender and sacrifice. Jesus came to establish a new kingdom. So much of Jesus' teachings are about the kingdom. He uses illustration after illustration, parable forms of teaching, to tell people, listen, the kingdom of God is so precious. It's easy to dismiss because this is not exterior kingdom. But he says it's like a treasure hidden in a field, and you do anything to find it. The kingdom of God has the capacity to spread and change the world. Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like yeast. You drop it into a big lump of dough, and it has the power to infiltrate and influence and bring life and generate new things. Jesus said, my kingdom, he came to be ruler of what? You. Me, each and every one of us. I want to read one more scripture. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's reflecting back to a group of people on what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Okay, let's read this together. This is from the book of Galatians. But when the set time had fully come, just pause there for a moment. When Paul says the set time, he's this brilliant man, and he's thinking about human history. So why did Jesus the Messiah come 2,000 years ago? Well, I don't know all the reasons, but I can point towards a few possibilities. It's the first time that the world, at least the known world, has all shared a language. The Greeks, Alexander the Great, had conquered most of the known world. Rome comes in and goes, hey, everybody already knows Greek. Let's not teach them Latin. We'll speak Greek as well. And so from India to Portugal, from Great Britain to North Africa, everybody speaks one language. It's the only time that the world has ever seen where shipping lanes are protected by the power of the Roman Empire. The Apostle Paul could hop on a ship and travel the known world and plant churches. It's the only time where there are paved roads wide enough for a chariot that go from Rome to Britain. It's the one time in human history, and God says, this is the set time. I've been promising the Messiah. This is the moment where if I sent the Messiah now, people from all walks of life who speak every language from every culture would be able to understand what I am doing. God sent his son. He sent the Messiah, born not of a woman. We referenced it last week that Joseph wasn't Jesus' biological father. This is the incarnation. This is God entering the human condition. But he was born under the law in this old age to redeem, buy back, to save those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship, to create a new kingdom where I'm not an enemy with God, where I'm not hiding in shame from God, but instead I could be a son or a daughter. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. This is the interior kingdom that he came to establish, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. A fascinating phrase to put in here. So this is an Aramaic word, which is what local Jewish people spoke. It's a dialect. It's very specific. A little bit of Hebrew, a little bit of everything. And Abba is, it's the best way to translate it is the word daddy. Daddy. it's this incredible familiarity. I could tell you, hey, there have been some people who have been spiritual fathers or influential in my life, or maybe there's a priest and you call him father. But the term Abba, it's so intimate. It's what a 3-year-old child calls their dad, daddy. So here's what Paul is saying in Galatians. He's saying, don't miss what the Messiah came to do the first time. He came to take people who were stuck under law, and the best they had was be as intentional about religion as possible. And he came to move them into a new kingdom where he could create a family, where he could have men and women who were broken and inferior, and he could say, because of my kingdom, because of what I've done on the cross, you're my son. Turn to me, and you're my daughter. And human beings who had been isolated from God can now call him daddy. That's what the Messiah came to do. So at Christmas, we celebrate the arrival of Jesus, the Messiah. Epiphany means appearing. Advent means arrival. We celebrate because it's changed everything. You and I could be sons and daughters of the King because of what Jesus the Messiah did. We celebrate, but then we anticipate his second arrival to planet Earth, which will make all things